Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Fiona Fleming and I'm the CEO of the AIFST. I'm very pleased to welcome you all today. So, thanks, Andreas. You've got yourself started. So, before we begin, though, I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So I can see that Andreas has got his presentation ready to go. So we have three speakers today. The first one is Andreas Kleber from Quality Associates, and Andreas is going to talk to us about PEAL in practice, a view from the coalface. So I'll hand over to you, Andreas.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Fiona, and thank you all for coming along and listening to me talk a little bit about PEAL and some of the things that we've seen over the last year since PEAL was introduced that might be quite useful to share from seeing particular issues that might be out there or particular things that we really need to be careful with if we want to get our plain English allergen labeling correct. So my name is Andreas Kleber. I'm from Quality Associates, and we do a whole range of different activities in the food safety and quality space, including training courses, consulting, food labeling reviews, things like that. So we're directly involved with allergen management and vital training. So that's something that we do a lot of, and we also do a lot of food label and compliance reviews as well. And so that's the information that I'm sharing with you from those activities today. We do have a number of training courses. As I mentioned, we've also got an online training portal. So we actually have a food labeling course within that as well, if you're interested. And that covers everything in relation to plain English allergen labeling and a lot more in that space as well. But today I want to really talk about PEAL, or plain English allergen labeling, and we've had that with us now for the last year or so. So there are lots of useful things that have come out of practice looking at how to implement these things. And so the first thing I just want to mention, and I'm sure the Allergen Bureau will talk a lot more about the Food Industry Guide to Allergen Management and Labeling that has been updated to include PEAL. But that basically goes along with standard 1.2.3 in the Food Standards Code and Schedule 9, which talks about mandatory advisory statements and declarations. And so the mandatory declarations, that's where it talks about what allergens have to be labeled and in what manner. So there's quite a bit of information to digest within those documents. The main thing, though, that we need to remember is that we've got a little bit of time left to implement the changes that are required in the plain English allergen labeling requirements. And so that transition period ends in 2 years' time. Now, that might seem that we have still quite a lot of time up our sleeves, but if you think about a typical product development cycle, you know, it might take 6 months before labels are redone. And if you have to do a whole lot of different labels, all trying to meet that deadline, it becomes quite a bit of exercise. And so currently in the transition period, you can still label according to the old Food Standards Code requirements. That's still valid at this stage, but going forward, it's a good idea that any labels that you're doing now actually take into account the plain English allergen labeling requirements. Now, for stock in trade, so for anything like frozen foods or canned foods that can last quite a long time, there's actually a post-transition period, and basically any foods that were packaged and labeled before the end of the transition period have another 2 years after that to actually trade through those products. So that's in a recognition really that it takes some time for us to do these things, and we don't really want to create food waste when we're going through this transition. But they're the hard deadlines, and we need to think very carefully about how we actually go through that as far as our business is concerned. So there's some practical challenges with PEAL, and that is because there's a number of things that we need to do to be compliant. First of all, and I'll expand on that a little bit more, is there actually new allergens that have to be declared. So things that we didn't declare previously now are required to be on the label. And there's also different ways of declaring them. But if we want to declare those allergens, we need to make sure we have the correct ingredient specifications or product information forms or PIFs. We need to make sure that we actually update our PIFs and recipes regularly. We need to make sure we construct the correct label, and then we see quite often recalls associated with applying an incorrect label. So basically, that's still something that's costing the industry a lot of money every year. And so let's first talk about the new allergens. So now going forward, we have to label mollusk. But mollusks are only the marine species, so we're not having to label snails and things like that. But we now in the seafood space have fish, crustacea, and mollusks that we have to label as separate entities. Whereas previously there was no way to label mollusk unless it was done voluntarily. People might have included it under fish, maybe under crustacea, but it's now very, very clear that they're actually three different things and we need to declare each one of those. We also have to be more explanatory as far as what tree nuts we're actually using. So we now need to declare the actual nut. We can't just declare tree nuts. So for example, almond would have to be specified or cashews, for example. And as before, there's a whole range of what we call nuts like coconut, nutmeg, and shea nuts that are actually specifically called out as not being nuts. So that's useful as far as the definition is concerned. So we need to start thinking now, where have we included the ingredients that might contain mollusks or specific tree nuts, and how does that need to flow through to our labeling? Gluten is also now required to be stated as far as the content in things like wheat, barley, and rye is concerned. So where in the past we may not have actually mentioned gluten specifically. So clearly, if gluten is an ingredient, then it needs to go into the ingredient statement. In the allergen summary statement, which will now be mandatory, which was not mandatory previously, we need to now state if wheat or its hybridized strains are present, and if gluten was present, that also needs to be stated in the allergen summary statement. So wheat and gluten both, if wheat is an ingredient and it contains gluten. And if we're using oats, barley, and rye or its hybridized strains, basically then in the allergen summary statement, we only need to declare gluten. So we don't need to declare oats as well in the summary statement, for example. And on the right-hand side there, I've just given you some example of different hybridized or types of wheats, for example. And if we're looking at triticale, which is a hybrid of wheat and rye, we would actually have to declare both wheat and rye as far as that goes. So we need to be quite clear what the types of allergens are and what we have to actually declare in our labels. And so then that takes us to the correct ingredient specification. So really we need to go back and we need to make sure that we're actually declaring all of the allergens that need to be declared on the PEAL going forward. And so I've just brought up some example specifications that I've reviewed over the last little while, and we can sort of see that there are some issues. And so if we're looking at the ingredients declaration there, whole egg, that's fine because egg is separately stated. We then see milk solids, so that's fine as well. And then we see sour cream, but sour cream hasn't stated that milk is actually present within that. So that's something that we need to be very careful with when that goes later onto the label. Now then, if we're looking at the allergens listed by the supplier, egg is fine, dairy is not correct. It should say milk. And then if I look at soy, I'm start asking myself, where is soy actually present, in which one of the ingredients, because the ingredients don't actually declare where soy is actually present. So we're starting to see quite a few inconsistencies within this one ingredient specification. And so clearly there are some questions to be asked of that supplier. And so if you wanted to have the ingredients and the contain statement correctly, in this case now you would bold it. So whole egg, milk solids, which is acceptable. Sour cream, you would say in brackets milk or from milk. And then in this case, we actually had soy within the vegetable gum. So we then declare contains soy. And then the summary statement simply says contains egg, milk, and soy, or comma, soy. We're not actually allowed to use the word and, because it says the only words that you're allowed to use within the allergen summary statement is contains and the actual allergens. And so commas and those things are fine, but you can't use the word and. Going on to the next one here, another one where we have incorrect declaration and missing ingredients. So we have cheese powder, which has milk solids and cheese solids. So in that question is then, is that also containing milk? So that's something that we would need to sort out as far as the label is concerned. Again, we're seeing an error on dairy, which is not correct as far as an allergen is concerned. It has to be milk. We don't see egg and we don't see soy in the ingredients. And so we need to go back again and identify where we actually have those particular allergens present. And that needs to go into the ingredient statement as well. Otherwise, that will be incorrect. And so here then we had ingredients where basically this is a marinated vegetable mix, lots of different vegetables, but it also contains feta. So feta cheese is made from milk, and that would need to be declared. And so we need to start going through all of our ingredients with the fine-tooth comb and actually see where our suppliers potentially have forgotten to actually declare an allergen. We also need to understand the foods. So we need to know that feta, excuse me, feta is a cheese, and therefore that will contain milk. And there's a whole range of other foods that we need to be careful with. For example, tahini. We need to understand that that's actually from sesame. So we do need to know something about the foods that we're checking so we can actually get a good sense check of what's correct and what's not. Sorry. Also then, we need to start thinking about our allergen matrix. In most food businesses, we list the foods that we produce, and we have a matrix that says these gluten, milk, peanut, soy, etc. are present within the food. But as you can see here, we haven't actually listed mollusk. So we need to now go back to all of our allergen matrices and start looking at where, for example, oyster sauce is used. We need to highlight that mollusk is contained within that product. And so it's not just looking at the specifications, but it's looking at the allergen matrices that we hold and make sure that we actually make sure we label everything correctly so we don't overlook something. And clearly tree nuts in this case is not sufficient either, because we have to declare individual tree nuts as far as that's concerned as well. And we need to revisit rework controls. So in the past, if mollusk, for example, wasn't a declarable allergen, and we haven't managed that separately as an allergen, we need to now go back and check that no rework containing mollusk goes into food that doesn't declare it, because you then have a potential recall on your hands. So there's quite a bit of background work to be done as far as updating our allergen matrix and rework permissions is concerned. And then if we're looking at our PIFs, I've given you some examples that I've actually seen last year, so 2021. And this one basically was issued in 2012. I would be very nervous indeed if I was given that, because how many things have changed in those intervening 9 years? Best practice would say you change your PIFs and update them once a year or when something changes. And that's where some of the digital PIF platforms are actually quite useful, because the manufacturer or supplier of that raw material can actually update that very easily, and that ends up in your inbox and you don't forget to do it. but it's really not a good idea to leave it this long. The other thing that I'm slightly concerned about with this one is that it says this product does not contain allergens. Now you have to ask the question, which allergens? Is it the list that's in the Food Standards Code or somebody else's list? And clearly there are people that can be allergic to just about anything. Could be cherries, apples, could be coriander, for example. So there are people that are allergic to some of these, but as far as the Food Standards Code is concerned, they don't need to be declared. So just to say this product does not contain allergen is A, not accurate, and B, is a bit misleading, and you would be quite concerned that the person doesn't actually understand what they actually have to declare. So that's something that I would follow up on. Here's another one from 2015, and it says this product does not contain any known allergens. And again, you end up in the situation where this is actually a false claim, because all foods potentially could become allergenic. So we just need to be a little bit careful in what information we're being provided and whether we can just believe what they're giving to us, or whether they're hints that they don't actually quite understand what we're looking for. And then we have to get our labels correct. So assuming we now have all the correct raw material information, we've updated what allergens we have to declare. We just have to make sure we design the label correctly as well. And so in this one here, we have a vegan protein bar. It says peanut butter. Peanut was declared, but cashews, which also was in that product, was not. And so we have to be very, very careful that we actually now start declaring everything. And as I said before, we used to be able to say tree nuts. You can't say that anymore. So we have to be very precise which actual tree nuts actually go in there. And so that's where we have to have a much better understanding of specifications and how that actually flows through onto the label. So a correct label would have these components, and I won't go through the vital statement, so the precautionary allergen statement. Specifically, that is still voluntary in the regulations. So that's something that you can do to cover yourself as far as cross-contact is concerned. And you would say may contain, or if you're using the vital calculator, you would say may be present. But what is required by law is basically the statement of ingredients and the summary statement. And in both of those, you have to actually declare the allergens that are contained within the food. So it basically has to be declared twice. And so you have twice as many chances as getting it wrong. So you have to cross-check and make sure that there are no inconsistencies between the two. The other things we can see there is that you can use plural or singular if it makes sense, doesn't make any difference. And basically we have to bold it. The summary statement has to be the same font size and type, and it also has to be bolded. And those two statements have to be close to each other in the same field of vision. So there's quite a few elements that actually have to be fulfilled if you want to get the ingredients and the allergen summary statements correct. And so some of the things that we need to think about is that we need to bold the allergens. So that's something that's a new requirement. We can't have any additional words to contains in the actual allergens. As I've mentioned, the two statements have to be next to each other in the same field of vision, same font and size. And as I said, there needs to be a lot of cross-checking so we don't make mistakes. Precautionary statement is still voluntary, singular, plural is okay. And then we need to think about that the allergen stated must actually be a word on its own. So you can't say buttermilk, you would have to say buttermilk in brackets milk. So it has to be a separate identifiable word in itself, the allergen. So that's really quite an important requirement. And so if we're looking at an old label that we might have had for, in this case, beef ravioli, we have to start bolding a few things. So durum, wheat, semolina, wheat would have to be highlighted. We then have cereal flour, so we need to actually identify what cereal that is. Is it wheat? Is it something else? Vegetable oil, we need to go back and find out whether that's actually containing soy or if it doesn't. Cheese, well, we haven't actually declared milk, so we need to put that in there. TVP, so textured vegetable protein, probably not a good abbreviation, so that needs to change, but at least it says contains soy. At the bottom there, vegetable oil may contain soybean oil. That's also not appropriate. If it's a may contain, then it needs to go into a voluntary statement at the bottom. You would not indicate a may contain within the actual ingredients list. Looking then at contains gluten, egg, milk, and soy, the word and has to come out of there. Wheat is not included in it, so that has to be added in as well. And so there are a few mistakes that the old label has, and that needs to be basically caught up. We're also seeing the may contain crustacea, fish, peanuts, tree nuts, sesame seeds, sulfites, and lupins. And so in this case, tree nuts is acceptable because it's a voluntary statement. But you might also want to be more specific going forward, as people might be looking for specific nuts being mentioned. However, if you haven't got any of those nuts within the ingredients in a summary statement, tree nuts would still be acceptable because that's not actually required by regulation. So we need to go quite carefully through our old labels and make sure we bring them up to date. We need to also think about inconsistent statements as with the ingredients that we've talked about already. So we've got vinegar, we've got sulfites in there, but if we're looking at the contain statement, there's no sulfites in there. If we're looking at wheat and gluten in the contain statement, we don't actually know where it's contained in. And so going back to the ingredients, then the vinegar actually contained both wheat and barley. And so for barley, we only have to declare gluten in the contain statement, but wheat has to be mentioned separately, as I've indicated there as well. Soy and milk, well, we don't know where that's actually present, so there's an inconsistency there with the ingredients list. And so we constantly now have to double check that what we see here in both of those statements, it's actually consistent. Now, also, when we change ingredients, all of a sudden, there's a lot of consideration. So I've just basically shown a substitute of a mayonnaise on the left with a cleaner ingredients list, mayonnaise on the right. Some of the questions I would ask on the right-hand side there, what is actually in the vegetable oil? So does it contain soy, for example? Egg is still listed on the right as well as on the previous mayonnaise, so that doesn't change. Milk is no longer contained in the new mayonnaise, so we have to take that out of the allergen summary statement unless milk is actually contained within another ingredient. So we can't just take it out, we need to cross-check whether it's still present in some other ingredient. And then we've got soy, which is new, so we might have to add that into the label as well. So there are quite a few considerations as you're changing even a single ingredient. And so if you're looking at these declarations and you're changing your formulations, you need to keep up to date and update the labels at any given time. The other thing that we need to be quite mindful is that for the first time, we actually have to label allergens within processing aids. And keeping in mind that processing aids basically have a technical function during the process, but no longer have a function after the process, there can be quite a few of those that are being used, but that have never been declared previously. But now we have to declare if they contain an allergen. So for example, if a pan-releasing agent was used that contains soy as the base, in that case, we would have to declare processing aid in brackets soy. We don't have to say what the processing aid is. It clearly has to be one of the processing aids that's permitted in the Food Standards Code, but we have to declare that soy was present. And that's because even though there's no technical function, the allergen will still carry over and could cause issues. And so if we're looking at the old PIF documents, we have to look on the processing aids and make sure that we actually check for any processing aids and any allergens that are present within that. And equally, on the right-hand side there, for the allergen list, we need to make sure that people understand that the processing aid is formulated into the product, and so it's not a cross-contact. Soy, in this case, would need to be ticked under the deliberately added allergens. And so that's something that we probably have to take back to suppliers. In particular, if they're overseas, they may not be aware of some of these changes needed for Australia and New Zealand. And so we just need to make sure we communicate all of this back to our suppliers as well. And then if you have any claims on your label as well, it just gets even trickier, because as soon as we say gluten-free, for example, this is an absolute claim from the ACCC's point of view and the regulators in New Zealand as well. We can't say gluten-free if there are traces found. So it's not like in some countries where 20 parts per million would be acceptable for a gluten-free claim. In Australia and New Zealand, it means no gluten at all. And so if we're looking then at the Christmas licorice mix, looks all very nice. It says gluten-free at the top, and at the bottom it says contains gluten. So you already have an inconsistency there, but even though you declare it at the bottom, you still will end up with a recall because it says gluten-free at the top, and many people might just stick with that and not read the rest of the label. So this could be quite a problem. And the same thing with the dairy-free, soy-free, gluten-free, vegan caramel milk chocolate that actually contained milk. And so we just need to be quite careful that when we make claims that they're actually substantiable and we don't have issues. And if they're allergen-related claims and they're not true, we end up with a recall just because of the food safety risk associated with that. And then we need to stick the right label on, and that can be quite problematic. So this is just one of the many examples of recalls associated with incorrect labels being applied. And so in this case, it was basically undeclared hazelnut because the hazelnut containing product was packed into the wrong box. So there can be quite a lot of things that actually lead us to that. And one of them is that for brand, often the labels are very similar. So it can be quite easy for people to make a mistake and assume that it shows one label when it's actually another. If we have a front and back label, are they actually corresponding? And I've seen a lot of label designs also where the back label doesn't actually state what the product is. You have to guess from the ingredients list what the product actually is that this back label goes with. You might have incomplete checks online. Line clearance issues are always something that we find as a potential issue. And human error, when you're looking at lots of labels, can also happen. And so needs a lot of training and diligence to make sure we don't get this wrong. And then in many companies, we still don't have automated scanning of labels. So by scanning the barcode, you can actually then cross-reference that with the food that you're producing. And if that doesn't match, the line basically stops. Now, it's not foolproof. I'm aware at least of one case where they had automated scanning, the machine broke down, they forgot about their manual checks, and they ended up with a recall because the label was wrong. So we need to have our backup systems working as well. So thank you very much for your attention. I just also mentioned that we have actually an app which has a lot of our food safety webinars on it. So if you wanted to have a look at that, on further information as well about our courses. But I leave questions for later on after the other speakers. And with that, let's go back to Fiona. Thank you.
And